This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast. My name is Sam, and I'm your host, and I'm joined by the Richard Blackaby himself.
Great to be with you, Sam.
It's always a pleasure, Richard. It's always nice to sit across from you and think deep things about leadership, and I'll ask dumb questions, and you'll set me on the right course. And
I do what I can.
You know,
I make no promises.
Well, we appreciate that. One of the things that I really love. One of the segments, I guess, that we do and a lot of our listeners really love as well is when we look at leaders in the past, and usually usually fairly distant past, present leaders that we look at, and presidents and various people. And today we're going to look at what we thought we had already done, a biography on the great and powerful Truman.
Yes.
President of the U.S. And I actually, funny enough, this is a book that I read.
I finally stumbled on one.
Yeah, you had to look high and low, but
we got
eventually...
into Dr. Seuss, and so that was it.
Yeah. So this is a pretty hefty book.
Yeah, it's over 1,100
by
pages.
David McCullough.
Yeah, David McCullough. This book on Truman is actually considered a classic presidential biography. Of course, there's a number of biographies written on various presidents, but this one, David McCullough, of course, is a very respected historian, and this is kind of considered a standard work now on what a presidential biography should be like. Well-researched, well-written, interesting, insightful. And so, certainly if you're looking for a presidential biography, this is the one to read on Truman.
And McCullough, that's sort of his thing, right? Is these big
he's
biographies?
done that, and then he's done some histories as well. Like he's written on
I think 1776. Is that by him as well? Yeah.
He's written several. I think he's the one that wrote most of his on like manual typewriters or something. He's like an older guy that does it old school way, but
that's
it's
hardcore.
done well. Yeah, I think he won the Pulitzer Prize for this one. So, it's a well read one. I remember this particular biography because when I read it, I was doing an experiment, and this is the book when people tell me that they don't have time to read, I just feel like normally that just means that they're just not using their time well. So I took this book with me, and I tried to read it just on time that otherwise would have been wasted. So like I went to the doctor, I read this in the waiting room. And then if you're delayed 30 minutes, running late, I've had 30 minutes to read. And every time I went to meet someone for lunch or breakfast in a restaurant, I'd bring this book in, and I had it in my car, and I went to pick up a kid from school. And it took me less than a month to read a 1,100-page book, and just purely was time that otherwise I would have sat there just frustrated waiting. And so instead I got to read one of the best presidential biographies out there. And so, it can be done, even these long books, especially when they're well written, then it's easy just to pick up.
It makes it easier to plow through if it's a good read.
And of course, I'm fascinated by the 20th century. So much happened of such epic proportions, and certainly with Truman, he faces some of those things. And we've talked about this before, but there's a lot of ratings where historians will kind of rate the top presidents or all the presidents. Where do you rate them in terms of greatest? And Truman oftentimes slips into the top five. Oftentimes he'll be listed perhaps at number 4, number 5. And what's interesting about that is, of course, there's a number of reasons that we can kind of touch on, but of course, he's the one who said the buck stops here, and he's quite famous for that saying. And what he realized was that as a leader, he was paid to decide. He was paid to make decisions, and he had to be willing to face the consequences for the decisions he made, which a lot of politicians today try to have an escape clause where if something goes wrong, they have a way of blaming someone else. And Truman did not do that. And of course, he faced some of the biggest decisions that a U.S. president had ever made. Of course, he's the one who decided to drop an atomic bomb, the only president to ever decide that. He decided to do an airlift into Berlin when the Soviet Union tried to seal off Berlin and starve out the western side that belonged to the West. He decided to go into war in Korea when, again, the potential for a nuclear war and a third world war loomed before him. And he chose to fire MacArthur when MacArthur was one of the most popular war heroes of World War II. He made a number of decisions that it sometimes were not always popular, especially at the time.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that when Truman left office, he had a very low approval rating. At one point, I think it got down to like 23% or so. And so what he also sort of exemplifies is the fact that oftentimes history, you need a bit of time for history to evaluate what you did, because of course there's always rhetoric, and your opponents are constantly trying to belittle what you've done and make it seem not important, or to magnify your mistakes as if they're just catastrophic. And so you need some history to pass where things settle down, and you can look back and say, well, everybody said that he was going to, cause World War III, but of course he didn't. And everyone said that what he was doing was terrible, but now as we look back, we realize, no, that actually was great. And so he has sort of risen in the polls ever since he left office, to where he's often rated in the top 5. And other presidents, at times they leave office quite popular, but as you have time to evaluate, well, what did they actually do that lasted? Cut out all the hype and all the PR and stuff and the spin, and what lasted from them that was good. And sometimes popular presidents, they go down in the polls, because the more you evaluate their contribution, you realize once all their marketing and publicity people aren't around, there's not necessarily as much there as you thought. So Truman is certainly one of those guys that falls in that category. And like all the biographies that we've seen, he's one of those unlikely people. Again, he's when he's a child, he has terrible eyesight. In fact, he says he was blind as a mole, and he couldn't catch a ball. He couldn't really play sports. He said it was kind of life changing when finally he was given glasses. And he grew up in Independence, Missouri, when he, as a boy in Missouri, only sissies wore glasses back in that time. Yeah. And, supposedly. And so he was not athletic. He never got into fights. He was not that popular in a lot of ways. Just not the kind of guy that you're going to expect to become some champion in World War II kind of thing. But he was a bookworm. He loved history, which, of course, that's one of the reasons I like him. Yeah. And he loved people who made history, and a lot of those were military leaders. Generals were kind of his favorite people. But if you look at his life, like we've seen with a lot of these biographies, he faced a lot of adversity. And his own father, he greatly respected his dad. His dad was a man of principle in many ways, but suffered financially. At one point, his dad declared bankruptcy, and it was a very humiliating time. They had no money. They were quite poor. It was kind of shameful. His father-in-law ultimately committed suicide. And again, that was quite a shameful thing in that day and that culture. Truman was not, in many ways, his journey is a lot like Abraham Lincoln's, trying to make a go on the farm and not having a lot of success with that. It just seemed like bad luck, just continually
he tried a haberdashery or something at one point.
Yeah, and ultimately they go belly up, and he And of course, they could have just declared bankruptcy and walked away from everything. But he was a person of integrity, and he was determined that he would pay back everybody whatever they owed. And it took him over 15 years that he's still paying people for what they owed them, and he was just that kind of person. And so, of course, it just meant he didn't have a lot of money himself, and he really never did. Even when he finally leaves the presidency, back when he left, they didn't even. I don't think they even had any kind of income as a former president, and it was because of Truman, I think. And he basically, all he had when he left the presidency was he got a little over $100 a month from being a World War I veteran, and so it was some friends of Truman's that ultimately campaigned to say, hey, if you've been president for basically 8 years, you ought to have some kind of retirement income from that. And they did that primarily because Truman had nothing. And so, in fact, when he was even a U.S. senator, he was actually going to get like free dental work at a clinic that was helping poor people, because he couldn't afford to go to a dentist, even though he's a U.S. senator. And of course, he could have been corrupt. He could have sold favors and used his influence to enrich himself.
It sounds like, I forget the names of the cohort of guys there in Missouri, but it sounds like there's a lot of kind of mob boss types that he was around, and so he very well could have done well for himself.
Yeah, there was a guy named Pendergrast who was kind of the main kind of boss of Kansas City,
sort of
St. Louis
the
area.
kingmaker of Kansas City.
Yeah, and he'll ultimately get in trouble with the law and the FBI, but that Truman really, I mean, and he does everything kind of late. He gets married when he's about 35 or so, and part of that was because he loved his future wife, Bessie, and desperately wanted to marry her, but felt unworthy and wanted to somehow get some financial stability to make sure he could take care of her properly. And then World War I comes around, and his eyesight is so bad that he can't qualify to be a soldier. And he's also a farmer at that time, and farmers were exempt from the draft. They needed farmers to stay and make and produce food, but he basically memorizes the eye chart so that he can pass. He can't read it, but he memorizes it so he knows what each letter is supposed to be. And even then, just barely gets in. At one point, a doctor is giving him a physical and is about to fail him, and Truman just basically won't let him fail him. Just keeps talking to him until he finally puts him on through. And it was really in World War I that he ultimately gets into the artillery and discovers that he's actually a really good leader. He rises up to be an officer, and he applied to West Point originally, and he gets turned down because of his eyesight. And he'll ultimately always have a bit of a sort of a love-hate relationship with West Point, because a lot of the military aristocrats like MacArthur and others go there, but he was turned down by West Point.
Yeah, and he had such esteem for the military.
Yeah, and that would have, but he just never had an easy road, and so he'd apply and try to get in and be turned down, but he comes out of World War I having proven his mettle, and basically Truman's a person who likes people, and he's a person of integrity, a person that will work very hard at whatever job he's given. And he finally gets a bit of a break with this Pendergrast, this powers that be, that want him to be their man, and they give him a couple of kind of government positions out in Missouri, and he does it with zeal. I mean, he's the kind of guy, you give him a job, and then all of a sudden he's cleaning up the mess, and he's cutting expenses, and they're within budget, and they're reducing the debt that he inherited, but he just says up front, I'm not going to. Basically, I won't be corrupt. I won't take bribes. I won't. And they'll come to him and say, back at one point, they were saying, okay, but we'll put you in this job, but you can't hire Catholics, or you can't hire, African Americans or whatever. And he would just say, I just won't be bound by that. If you put me in there, I'll hire the best people and so on, and I'm not going to discriminate. And so there's times he'll lose jobs because of that. But also he could easily have enriched himself and taken bribes. He's responsible for handing out all kinds of contracts on roads and things that would be easy to take bribes for, and which he doesn't. And so he never has a lot of money. But and then even when he becomes, he becomes a senator at one point, and he doesn't talk a lot, doesn't make a lot of speeches. He was never a great orator. His biographer says early on when he first started making political speeches, he said the best thing about them was that they were short. He kept them brief, and eventually he'll become a U.S. senator, and he doesn't give a lot of speeches, doesn't draw a lot of attention to himself, but he always does his homework. He's always prepared, and he's loyal, sometimes even to a fault. Eventually, when this Pendergast is Hoover at the FBI is trying to get after, take him down, and politically it would be really smart of Truman to distance himself and not, admit that he was friends with someone that is a criminal, but Truman knows that this guy gave him his break, and he's always been good to him, and Truman just won't do it, even when it's politically, that's part of why his popularity sometimes will go down, because he'll say, this guy's always been good to me, why would I throw him under the bus?
Yeah.
And so that with Truman. It's also interesting because when he leaves office as president, his approval rating is one of the lowest of any outgoing presidents ever. But they said the people that were closest to him liked him the most. I mean, the closer you got to him, when you got past all the newspaper headlines and all the political attacks, and you actually work with him, McCullough says people were very, very loyal to him in return. And they said, a lot of times people will sort of write tell-all books after someone's been the president, and they work with them for 2 years, and now they tell all the dirt of what that guy did. McCullough says none of his close aides and workers ever did that to him. They always stayed loyal to him. And Truman they just say that he always remembered where he came from and where he was going, and just never would get a big head about it. And because of that, he would just do things that had not been done by others. And he would, for instance, when the White House kitchen had made a particularly good dessert or meal or something, he'd go back into the kitchen to thank the chef who made it. And that was just unheard of. Franklin had been the president before Truman, and he was an aristocrat, and that was just expected. You didn't go in the kitchen to thank anybody. And at one point, famous and Truman was actually a very good pianist himself. And at one point, they brought in someone to the White House, a Liszt, I think, to do a concert and play some music. And when Liszt needed someone to turn the music pages over, Truman got up and was doing that for him.
Yeah.
And afterward, Liszt was saying, "Can you imagine, like, the president of the United States turning my music pages for me?" But Truman just never was the kind of guy who put on airs. Which, and the other thing about Truman is that he followed one of the most popular presidents of all time.
Yeah.
The only guy to win 4 elections, and so he was always being compared to Roosevelt. And Roosevelt put on airs, and Roosevelt always put on a good face, and in front of the cameras he was charming, and Truman just refused to sort of play to the camera. Truman would just would be himself,
kind of a no nonsense.
And so of course that
kind of
doesn't
guy.
play as well to just popular audiences, and there were those who felt like Truman he could identify with the common man, and there were a lot of people that who could relate to him. They felt like this guy is just no nonsense, tells the truth. You know what you get with him. Won't be flashy, won't be spectacular, but at least you kind of can take it to the bank. You know, what Truman says is what he's going to do. And of course, he gets when Franklin Roosevelt, he runs 4 times for president, and he had I think 3 different vice presidents in that time, but in the end, when he runs for the last time, is when Truman finally is made vice president, and Truman, Roosevelt's never all excited about Truman. He just feels like, well, he's can do me the least damage.
Yeah.
Sort of not a rousing, voice of support, but.
I think because the other guys didn't have like they had a bunch of issues, and so it was like, well, Truman's kind of the cleanest of the bunch.
Yeah, and Truman actually had just been chairman of a committee that had looked at all the government contracts in the military.
That's right, yeah.
And they were spending a fortune.
The Truman Commission, right?
Yeah, and of course he's a no-nonsense kind of guy, and just did not tolerate bribes and little paybacks and stuff, and he just sees a lot of inefficiency, a lot of money the government's spending that it doesn't need to be spending. And so he just really tightens things up, and he saves the government millions of dollars when he cleans up the contracts. And so he builds a reputation as a no-nonsense, honest kind of guy that is for efficiency and so on. And so ultimately, Roosevelt says, okay, this guy can't hurt me. He's known for his honesty and so on, but he's not flashy, and so
they would never be friends.
No, they never ran around the same circles, and so I think Truman is probably vice president for like 88 days or something like that before Roosevelt dies, and he's made president. But I think Roosevelt met with them maybe twice in that time, and never really to talk seriously about policy or what was going on. And so like things like the atomic bomb, Truman doesn't even know about it until he's president, and then they kind of come into him and say, "Hey, you need to be aware of what's going on.
We've got some decisions to make here."
And Roosevelt had gone to Malta, I believe, to meet with Stalin and Churchill, and he didn't even take his vice president with him, even though Roosevelt is getting very feeble and frail, and his hands are shaking, and it's obvious that. To most people who are near Roosevelt, that he's not going to last 4 years. And yet he doesn't brief his vice president, and it doesn't take him with him in these world international meetings. And so when all of a sudden he dies, Truman is having to just speed up. He's never met with Churchill or Stalin and doesn't know about the atomic bomb. And all of a sudden it's up to him to sort all that out at the close of World War II.
I think that's the thing that is so crazy when I was reading this, is like the amount of stuff he had to like take in and then make a decision about in such a short amount of time. It's just crazy. Well, let's take a quick break here, and we'll wrap up when we come back. Come hear from Richard Blackaby live March 28th through the 30th at the Billy Graham Training Center at the Cove in an event titled The Senior Celebration, Living Victoriously in a Troubling, Confusing, and Dangerous World. Peace and tranquility can be shattered in an instant by our hostile culture or the trials we face. How do we live with joy and confidence in the Lord, no matter the circumstances? Come study Mark 4 and learn to rest in Christ's power to deliver us from the brokenness of our world. Richard would love to meet you at this event, and we hope to see you there. You can find out more at thecove.org, and we'll leave links in the show notes. So, Richard, there's a lot that I think leaders can learn from Truman. There's a lot of things that he did well as a leader. Mm-hmm. And so in the time we have remaining here, why don't you just maybe outline a couple of those things that sort of stand out to you from his career and his time as president as well?
Well, Truman's one of those who said it's amazing what you can get done if you don't mind who gets the credit.
Yeah.
And so, for instance, George Marshall became a Secretary of State and developed what became the Marshall Plan, which basically saved Europe. After the war, Europe was devastated by all the destruction, and the Marshall Plan allowed, I think, up to about 17 different countries ultimately took advantage of that to rebuild. And so when you looked at like West Germany compared to East Germany, it was just even years later, there still was all kinds of destruction on the eastern side, but West Germany was a modern, bustling city.
Yeah.
And so, of course, Truman could easily have taken that and called it the Truman Plan. He was the president. He's the one who approved it. But Truman said George Marshall's the one who came up with it. So he said, no, we should name it after you. It was your idea. And he just never had his ego get in the way. And so that enabled him to get a lot done. And it's also said, there's an interesting picture in the book of Truman's desk. And it says that the longer he was in office, the more conscious he became of time. And there's more and more clocks on his desk. I imagine some were probably given as gifts. And so over the time, he just has more and more clocks to put there. But they said he was just very much aware of the importance of the time that he had and the opportunity to be an influence. And so he did not want to waste his time. And he was always doing his homework. He was always prepared. He was always willing to make tough decisions, regardless of how unpopular it might be. And I think that is one of the things I think that we can certainly learn a lot from him today. Is now the politicians are more concerned of just don't let anything stick to them that's negative. Spin everything to be positive. And Truman would just say, I had to make some tough decisions, and only history may prove whether they were wise or not. But at the time, I did my homework, and I made the decision, and no one else is to blame but me if it didn't go well, which is refreshing. And you just realize it's just not the way politicians function basically today. The other thing that's interesting is that he was very close family and very close to his wife all of the years. And there's some interesting stories where he was meticulous about avoiding any even appearance of compromise. At one point, he was called to a meeting, and he took someone else with him to a hotel. When they came to the door, some scantily clothed woman came to the door. It was basically kind of a setup to get some dirt on him. And the aide that was with Truman later said Truman literally ran down the hallway. I mean, just ran to get away from there. And even the aide said it was almost hypersensitive to that. But and at another point, an aide was trying to ingratiate himself to Truman and said he could get him, whatever he wanted, he could get for him. If he wanted women, whatever he wanted, he just tried to help out the boss. And Truman just basically said, I've got everything I'd ever want in my wife, and I'm not, don't even mention that to me again. He was very loyal. His wife later in life said that no matter how busy her husband was in World War II and all that, she said every time I put my hand out, he always was there to take it. And so real very loyal person, very principled person. You might not agree with all of his political views, but you did have the feeling that he was making decisions out of conscience and out of what he truly believed was best. And wasn't perfect, certainly. Could sometimes trust you could be loyal to a friend to a fault sometimes. And there were times, but he couldn't stand people who put on airs, people that were phonies. And so people like MacArthur, who was so arrogant, so famous for his pride, and he's brilliant, but prideful and egocentric, and such an opposite of Truman that when it became obvious that he needed to be fired, Truman, of course, could have had people downline fire him, but he felt like he knew it would be unpopular. He knew that there'd be backlash, and so he chose to do it himself. And it just makes you wonder what our world would be like, our nation would be like today if leaders followed more of his example of, instead of trying to avoid anything negative being attached to you, maybe being known as the guy who just makes hard decisions, and then let history ultimately record what you were like. Once all the propaganda and hype is past, and people just look back on your days there. Were they good days? Were things made better because of you? Did you just put the best effort in? And certainly I've been a couple of places as a leader, and I think generally I'm just very grateful that when people look back on the period that I led, certainly you can second guess things that were decided, but you also realize, but they were good days, and stuff was happening, and it was positive, and things were growing, and despite your mistakes, you hope that as a leader, people can look back later with some perspective and say, those were actually really productive, fruitful days. A lot of good was done. And certainly for Truman, I think leaders, you ultimately have to just trust your leadership into the hands of history, that history will validate the leadership that you did with integrity. And at a certain point, you've got to walk away. And Truman was often he was just underestimated by a lot of his opponents. Of course, famously in 1948, he ran against Dewey, and Dewey was a Republican. He was highly favored. He was a very popular governor, I think, of New York, and Truman was such an underdog that famously some of the big papers actually had already printed out headlines: "Dewey wins."
Yeah.
Even though ultimately Truman would win, and Truman, I think, always got a great kick out of that. How many times he was not expected to win.
Wasn't there like a photo of him like holding up one of those
holding
papers
up a paper
just kind
saying
like
Dewey wins, and he didn't.
Smirking a little.
But I think Truman also just always had a faith in the common person.
Yeah.
That if you could just kind of talk straight with people, that he respected them and their opinions, and that you didn't have to spin everything and you didn't have to lie. He just felt like if people know the truth, they'll want to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And
well, he certainly puts in the work on the campaign trail, and I think that's when he goes up against Dewey. Like, you just see
out on
packed
train whistle
schedule.
stops.
Yeah,
and people said that he liked it. A lot of politicians will put on a fake smile and shake a lot of hands, but and then they get off camera and they could care less. But people said Truman genuinely cared about people. He liked people. He was.
Well, you get the sense that he was a statesman, and he knew that was what his job was. He wasn't there to kind of make himself great, but to serve the people.
And that's a great kind of point to end on, Sam. Is that we've always said there's a difference between a politician and a statesperson, and a statesperson is bigger. They have a longer view. They'll wade in and make the tough decisions. They're not so driven by winning the next election and holding on to office as they are about solving problems and doing what's best for the country, whether will ultimately be what's best for your career. And so he ends up, he ultimately writes a memoir, and he gets, there's some people that helped him out so that he didn't just end his life in poverty. But one of the last probably blue-collar kind of presidents, and Lincoln certainly was another one of those. And interesting, those two guys in particular. The top 5 presidents typically are Washington and Lincoln and the 2 Roosevelts and Truman. And the other 3 of them are kind of aristocrats. The Roosevelts and Washington, wealthy people.
Yeah.
But Lincoln and Truman are the blue-collar presidents who related to the people, and they have a very special place, I think, in American history as a result.
Sure. Yeah. Well, as always, we'll leave links to this book by David McCullough in the show notes, and until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.